Hey, good morning, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club for the month of March 2023. I want to welcome you all. We've got a really, really good book. This is the Kids Club selection, by the way. Should have said that first off. I never get these things right. And we've got a really good selection this month. And the book is A First Time for Everything by Dan. And I didn't ask this ahead of time. I'm going to assume it's SENTAT, but he's going to correct me if I'm wrong because he's right there.
Hey,
there you go.
How are you? Perfect.
Did I get that right? Is it SENTAT? Yeah.
Yeah, nothing too fancy.
Okay, very good. I should always ask authors, how do you pronounce your last name before the show? Because I've screwed it up a couple of times, but
it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, very good. Well, welcome to the show, man. Thanks for
it's a pleasure having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it is a pleasure having you. Absolutely. So I always start the show with the same question because I really like this question, and I think it kind of gets to what we're doing here, and it's why comics. Comics are an incredibly labor-intensive medium. They don't necessarily make a reward for most creators relative to the amount of labor that they put in. Yeah. And I'm sure you could probably find a better way, to make money from because you're very clearly a talented artist. So what is it about comics that thrills you, that excites you, that makes you want to put your time into this medium?
I was always a reluctant reader. My parents, they immigrated from Thailand, and so they weren't familiar with a lot of the Western classics. So reading to me was not developed early on in terms of, what can you say, like a passion for like pleasure reading. And it wasn't until years later I had a friend who had a paper route, and he had this big chest. He was a Marvel collector. He collected all the Marvel comics, and then that's just when it lit a fire in my soul, realizing, oh my gosh, comics are awesome. It's like my own soap opera, right? And I think my ability to draw really lent itself to the medium, but also I was never encouraged to be a writer. I was never encouraged to, do storytelling because my parents wanted me to grow up and be a doctor. So I never really relied on my abilities to be a storyteller. I didn't think I was very much of a good storyteller. So I would make my own fan comics, and, it started off with Spider-Man, just saying hi to some bad guys, and then it would just immediately get into a fist fight because that's the part that you really were excited about, drawing the action scenes, right? And then as the years went on, I started in picture books, and I always knew that I had a passion for the longer storytelling medium, and it wasn't until about 2010 when I released my first graphic novel, Sidekicks. And the thing about a graphic novel, I guess the best way you can say, when you talk to other creators, it's like climbing a mountain. At first you're thinking this is a very daunting task, but once you do it, you're like looking for the next mountain to climb, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
And so it's definitely an addiction that once you do one, you just keep wanting to do more. And for me, for the longest time, I felt like there was me leaning heavily into my ability to draw rather than to write text. But I feel like that playing field is starting to level off a little bit. Yeah. And I'm actually more comfortable in the medium than picture books as of lately. I feel like the next few books that I do in the near future will probably be more middle grade content. But you go back to what you love, what inspired you. And like even today, you go to a comic book shop that you used to shop at, and you see your comic being carried in that store that you like went to when you were a kid, and it's right. It's a dream come true.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. You did picture books, as you said, for quite some time. I mean, you had a great deal of success doing that. You won a KATT. That's kind of a big deal.
Right.
What was it that made you make the pivot to do Sidekicks, as your first graphic novel, as opposed to doing picture books?
So, I remember my editor, Arthur Levine, who, he edited the Harry Potter series. He initially bought the idea just based on a concept. And then it could have gone either way. It could have gone picture book, could have gone graphic novel. But I knew there was a deeper storyline that I wanted to tell with these characters. And, the issue here is when you do a picture book, you only have 32, 40 pages. So you can't really do a whole lot of backstory, a whole lot of character development. And there was a lot of that I wanted to get into. From that experience, man, I learned, it was like every mistake that you can make, I made. I remember just spending, oh my gosh, like a year of my life just boarding the whole thing out and putting in the text. And the thing ended up to be like 500 pages. Like, it was ridiculous. Right. And I remember my editor looking at it and saying, like, you know what? Like, you need to cut this down. You need to cut down, like, you need to cut out like 300 pages of this story. And I remember just like, I was like, oh my gosh, that was a whole year of my life learning a hard lesson. And then at the time I had a cartoon show on the Disney Channel called The Replacements. And, then that format was you write a script, you storyboard it out, and then you figure out all the hits and all the beats that you want to hit in the story. So I took that approach instead. It was much more efficient. And also, this was a time like graphics, Scholastic imprint graphics started, like in 2005, 2006. Yeah. And so they were still trying to get their legs. They were still trying to figure out, a system of making comics. So, I consider myself like one of the early pioneers of that whole market of trying to have Scholastic figure out. And at the time, like, Scholastic was like probably the only comic imprint out there for kids comics. Yeah. In terms of like the big 6 major publishers and things like that. So now that I've gone through that process, all the graphic novels that have come since have been a lot smoother. All the mistakes have been learned. And yeah, just it again, like I said, it's the real estate. It's the freedom to use some pages to build up a moment, to build tension. To develop characters. Those are things that I really can't necessarily do with much effectiveness in picture books.
Yeah, it's interesting because, on one hand you have the picture books, on the other hand you said you had the animation background, and both of those formats are pretty strict about how much real estate you have.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Yeah. You can't do a 3-hour cartoon, right? It's got to be 22 minutes or whatever that length is, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my question is what's the difference to you in having that extra space to be able to expand out the stories? That's probably a poorly phrased question, but do you understand what I'm trying to get to?
No, I understand what you're saying. So, I'll take, for example, my picture book, The Adventures of Beagle, the Unimaginary Friend. You have a lot of story building, you have a lot of preparation that you have to get into, but you only have a limited amount of space. So it's 40 pages. But in terms of world building, the problem that I had there was you had to establish the rules of the world. So you say, okay, we all understand the concept of the imaginary friend, but my take on it was, okay, there's an island where imaginary friends are born, but before they can meet their child, they're waiting for a child to imagine them. And then once that happens, a star picks them up off the island and takes them to the child, right? Just saying that, like, that's a lot of rules to establish. But then when you realize that you have it in a 40-page format, you realize that you have to establish those rules and make it clear in maybe 6 pages. And that is a very difficult thing to do. Now, I'm someone who, when I do storytelling, I kind of follow that whole design idea of form follows function. So rather than creating a character first, I tend to look at the story arc that I have and see what kind of character will be most conflicted by this. And so, sometimes if you're good at using symbology, which was something that I studied when I was doing advertising in art school, sometimes, you can have a character that embodies a certain idea, So I had a picture book called After the Fall, where Humpty Dumpty has to overcome his fear of heights. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about Humpty Dumpty is that if you just say Humpty Dumpty, you already know the backstory. I don't have to explain it to you, right? You're like, oh, he fell, he broke into a bunch of pieces. My entire first act is already solved by just saying Humpty Dumpty, and then I can spend the rest of the book, you know, talking about him overcoming his fears. And then also, if you do, you know, a well enough job of establishing those parameters, then you have more room to build pacing, you know, in terms of building the tension of him finally climbing the wall. Not so much with graphic novels. I mean, you know, you look at graphic novels, and I think in the kids market, like if we're talking about a really young age, they're aiming for like 126 pages tops. You know, for me, you know, oh gosh, I'm lucky to break under 200. You know, there's like so much stuff I want to tell, and then I think one thing that I realized in my brand of storytelling is that I rely heavily on flashbacks, which I just find that's something that obviously I'll probably want to explore with that a little bit more later on, but for now, I think it just comes from like influences from like cinema and things like that.
Sure.
But for me, I kind of like that whole thing where you imply something and then you echo it back later on in the story, and then the puzzle pieces just fit together. Like that's something I really find fascinating, right?
Sure.
So what I've realized is that, especially when I was in art school, I think I realized that my passion wasn't in making art, but it was storytelling, but I just happened to be an artist. And so, you know, in terms of storytelling, you know, I think you always tend to over-explain things because you want them to know as much as possible, like even like the setting and the details. Rather than me writing a description of a scene, it's just easier for me to write one panel, draw a panel like, here's your setting, here's your establishing shot, right? And so it's the best of both worlds for me. Yeah. You know, and I'll be honest with you. Like I said, I was a reluctant reader, so a lot of my upbringing was just watching, you know, 1980s TV shows and movies, and you know, and so you just have that sensibility in your head, and I just think very visually, and that's where it's become.
Sure. I wonder, because it seems to me, I know almost nothing about illustrated books, honestly, other than I've certainly read some to my child, but I know very little about the construction and the planning of it. But it seems to me that if you've got a 40-page book, you've only got 20 illustrations. And so those illustrations have to do a lot of work, right?
They do. And so, you know, typically, because I also illustrate other people's manuscripts. I work with other authors. And you know, you'll get a manuscript, and then you break up the text to fit, you know, the 32 or 40-page format. And one of the biggest struggles that you have when you're writing picture books is, you know, the brevity. You know, sometimes an author won't be able to have that other half of them to see the illustrations. Whereas I feel like I'm fortunate where I can see both in my head at the same time if I'm writing my own books. And I actually have a different format that is not really, you know, typical of everybody else's system. But what I'll typically do is I'll start with a concept of a story, and then I'll make a wordless picture book. And then from the wordless picture book, I see what's being told, and then I add the text on top of that to probably, you know, make light of what's not being told in the illustrations. And I find that to be the most effective means of keeping my text to a minimum. Right. And I learned that from Chip Kidd. I learned that in his graphic design book called Go. And, you know, one example that he gives is he says, you can show a picture of an apple, or you can write the word apple, but you don't want the two together because then it becomes redundant. And so I look at that and I, you know, I exercise that lesson, and it's really effective.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have to assume that that's not the way that most people doing picture books operate.
No, right? I mean, you know,
generally are writing the text first, and
right. I think you know, they're writing the manuscript first because they sell it to the publisher first, and then they find the illustrator. I think that's the misnomer a lot of people have, is that they think that the author finds the illustrator and then they sell it to the publisher, where in truth, it's the author selling the manuscript to the publisher, and then the publisher goes out to find an illustrator that matches this, this story. And there was a time, before social media, where the author and the illustrator never interacted because they never wanted the author's influence on the illustrator. They wanted the illustrator to come in with a fresh set of eyes. But because of social media, you'll have, this crossover of, hey, I like the drawings that you did in the book, or I didn't imagine him that way, So
yeah. That's a very different method than in comics.
Absolutely.
because in comics, I mean, when I speak to authors, people who are writers first and don't draw at all, they always say that the most critical thing to them, when they don't always have that option, but is to know exactly who's drawing their comic,
right?
And
right.
so that they can tailor the script to that person, right? Like, there's no point in writing a story, I don't know, on a horse farm if the illustrator is not interested in drawing horses, can only draw cars, right? Like, so you want to make sure that you're giving your artists something that they're going to enjoy working on for those months that they're going to be drawing it and redrawing it and conceptualizing and thinking about it.
Right. I remember I was working at Treyarch, the Activision company that does Call of Duty, Black Ops and things like that. And before we did Black Ops, we did, one of the ultimate Spider-Man video games, right? And Brian Michael Bendis would come in and he would look at the work, but then he would have some of his manuscripts in the server for us to read. And I remember I was just looking at all of them, and every panel description was very detailed, like, oh, panel number 1, page 3, this happens very specifically in this panel. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh gosh, as an illustrator, just me speaking personally, like that would drive me a little crazy. It's almost like like if you get a tattoo, and there's all these really talented tattoo artists that have their own styles and their own unique way of communicating with art. And then someone comes in and says, I want you to copy this drawing of, this exactly. And it's like, well, you're really diminishing, the illustrator's voice here by doing that. Sure. Like, I want to lend some respect to the illustrator. Again, like I said, it's a very different beast in comics. Like, that was the way it was for years and years and years. So I think there's people that adhere to that model. And then there's other people.
Yeah, I think Bendis in particular, his thinking comes from a screenplay.
Right.
And and not even screenplay, but a play. Like,
right. I think I read that in what was his book, Fortune and Glory. I think he mentioned something like that. Yeah. And it makes total sense. And the thing is, like, if you're good at orchestrating that, like, that's fantastic. I think for me, I think of the drawings that the drawings that Harvey Pekar did with American Splendor, where it's just like 2 stick figures, and then he gives it to Crumb and says, please make this something visually appealing, and Crumb just like, okay, I'll do my thing, like that. I need that flexibility, because it might be a case where they have something very specific, and you're right. Maybe I'm forced to draw horses, right? Yeah. And I will just handle that the best way possible. But if there's something very specific, I think it just stresses me out. Like, oh, he wants me to draw the horses this way, doing this. This is gonna drive me crazy.
Yeah. When you write your graphic novels, are you using a similar process to what you were doing with the picture books, where you're sort of drawing out a couple of key images and then working on the script, or like, what's your process there?
No, so my process is pretty much lifted from animation. So you write an outline, and the outline is the thing that the editor can appreciate. See the entire story arc. And then I script it out, almost like a movie script, right? Character says this, character says this. And you're basically just following the bullet points that you have in the outline. But you're kind of just adding life to the characters by giving them a voice, right? Then the different part that kind of deviates from animation is that I'll still storyboard it. I'll storyboard a panel, but then I'll just have a whole pool of panels, right? And then the graphic designer side of me takes 6 or 7 of the panels, and then I design a page around that, and I take chunks just enough to have an appealing page turn at the end, or you do have that moment where you're done fleshing out the entire comic with 220 pages or whatever, and you realize if you make a mistake somewhere, if you need to add a scene, it can just create ripples in the rest of the story.
Sure.
So, it's you kind of get to the page and you realize what you need to communicate. And then, you give yourself a little bit of freedom to recalibrate the panels, maybe add a couple panels, maybe subtract a panel, maybe turn it into a larger spread that can, pretty much encapsulate and communicate what 3 panels said, but you managed to do it in 1. That's kind of how you do damage control when you're scripting things out. But you keep everything really loose. And oh my gosh, I feel really bad for my editor, because my sketchers they're just a step above really loose stick figures and stuff. I'll see people, they're drawing their thumbnails almost to the point where it's like, I just have to ink over this and we're good to go. Whereas I'll show my editor, oh my gosh, this very loose stick figure, and just say, just trust me when I say this is me, and then they have to put my faith in it. Okay, well, you're lucky that you have a backlist for me to refer to, that sure. I'm aware that you're capable of taking this to the next step. But it might be a note where it says, I hope this is in a store, and I hope there's books on the wall, and it's yes, all those little hash marks, those are books on the wall, So I have to appreciate the patience that I have from my editor to meet me beyond halfway in terms of getting the project done.
So it sounds to me like in your process, and everybody has a different process in doing comics, right? Yeah. I told you this is something like our 200th interview. I've heard nearly 200 different ways of making comics, which is actually, I think, the greatest thing about comics. Yeah. But it sounds to me from what you're saying that that the editor needs to do sort of most of the work at the scripting stage. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the only true vision that the editor has is to make sure that the story is being told as best as possible. In terms of my job, if she says this plot point isn't working, you might want to reconfigure. You reconfigure in the script, and then you reconfigure in the sketches, and then sometimes things won't be evident until the final art, and then they'll say, oh, something didn't work out in the final art that you may have to recalibrate. So it could be just a whisper of a note from the editor, and then it could just bubble into this huge thing, So it really comes down to the editor making, what was my working relationship, it comes down to editor just makes sure that the story's flowing really well. And actually a majority of the work that I do is with the art director. The art director is the one that will, say, okay, well, maybe we need to condense this a little bit. Maybe, it's really great to have a navigator that just oversees all the work and, and says, well, we're gonna have this coming to, we're gonna have this, this little chunk of the story ending on the left side, and then we're gonna have a blank page here. So you might want to fill that with spot art or something like that, because you definitely lose your way when you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of PDF files, PSD files, and you're just kind of forgetting what ends up on the left, what ends up on the right. So the majority of the story navigating that I have is really with the art director.
Yeah, and it seems to me that in comics, it's particularly important as to whether something's on the left or the right, because the page turn, right, is almost the most valuable part of any 2 pages. Is that last panel. Right. Where is it going to make you want to turn to the next page and see what happens next?
Right. Because there's I've had several cases where I'll have something leading up on the left side, And then you're figuring out, well, what am I going to do on this right panel when I really want the reveal to happen on the page turn, right?
Yeah.
So you're sitting there, you're saying, okay, well, I could blow up some of these panels, or I could just break off into some dialogue leading up to it, like building tension, building that moment, which is great. It's a blessing if that's what you want to do, right? Or it could be a case where maybe you realize that you need to regress a page, right? So like rather than that aha moment coming, on the left side, and you realize that you need a page turn, you might condense the previous pages so that that page that was on the left ends up on the previous page, so that it ends up on the page turn. Like endless ways of navigating these things, sure. Right? And so, but
how often do you face those kinds of challenges where you have to rebuild or rethink it? Is it like every 10th page maybe, or does it happen more frequently, less frequently?
I mean, no, I wouldn't say it happens too frequently, because usually when there's a big aha moment, like you'll probably
you know it ahead of time, yeah,
right. You know it well ahead of time. In fact, you kind of earmark those and say like you have to hit this point, So yeah, it would happen. It would happen. I would say maybe 3 or 4 times in the book, and I would say 90% of the time I hit my mark.
Yeah,
there's only a couple pages where you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that on 50 pages earlier I was rambling. I don't have to ramble that much, and you're moving everything. You're just shifting everything. That's where the art director comes in handy, because depending on the publisher that you're working at, there's a way of naming files, and then you put it in into a folder, and then on top of that, then you have your colorist. You have the person that's like coloring the pages, and then suddenly you're just renaming all these files. And the poor colorist, the flatter, is just like, well, okay, did I already do this? Because this file's been renamed. It's a nightmare. Just creates ripples in the whole system. Yeah.
Interesting. That's I don't think that I've heard that particular issue before. I like that. Did you? I mean, you said you went to art school. Did you go to art school for just illustration broadly, or?
I initially, so prior to my art school education, I went to college. I got a degree in microbiology, and I was like this close to going to dental school. And then all my college roommates, they knew that I had a passion for art, and I wasn't the kid that was like going to defy my parents and say, no, I'm going to go to art school. It was my college roommates at the time, my senior year. They said, well, why don't you just see if you can get into art school? Aren't you curious to see if you're good enough to get into art school? And that was the initiative that I had, because I thought, yeah, I am curious to see if I'm good enough to get into art school. So, threw together a portfolio. Graduation day, I got in. I remember telling my parents, like, I think I'm going to art school. I'm not going to go to, dental school. And my parents were like, okay, well, this is a shock, but we just want you to be happy. And it was around the time when Lion King was in theaters, and I thought I wanted to be an animator. I thought I wanted to go to Pixar or Disney or DreamWorks and make movies and things like that. And then when I got to art school, I remember taking a computer animation course, and it was the most frustrating thing ever, and it took working on a computer software to animate anything. You're working with like engineer's tools, where you're saying to yourself, I just want to make a shiny ball, and rather than a button that says make this shiny, it's just a whole math algorithm to try, to measure the specularity and the ambient lighting, like from a measure of 0 to 1 on the sine wave. And you're like, I just want to make the ball shiny. And it took me 14 weeks to make 1 minute of film. And I think that was the tipping point where I realized there has to be a better way to tell stories. And so my initial intention was to be an animator, but then I took a children's book illustration course down the hall, and it opened my eyes, because I realized, oh, picture books, 32 pages, I can tell a whole story. Like, this is more my speed. So it was never, I think I was pretty late in the game when I realized that I wanted to do picture books. Like I took a course just based on the frustrations of what my initial intentions were. And I just realized that I discovered something even better.
Yeah. Interesting. So I assume that means that you haven't really had any formal training in sequential art, in panel to panel storytelling, right? It's been stuff that you've picked up through osmosis. Yeah?
Right. Well, I mean, I think everyone, I think every comic person has their education reading the McCloud, making
Sure.
comics and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And the education also comes from just reading, So this is something that I've realized, which I never understood until recently. But when graphic novels were first coming out and you would go on social media and you'd see librarians talking about comics, you would just see some of these people completely befuddled at the fact that I think they were overthinking it, or they're just overwhelmed at the whole idea of, wait, do I read the words first or I look at the panel? And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, you read the panel and then you move on to the next panel. And they're just like, what do you mean? Like, which panel do I read next? And I realized that that's a muscle that you educate, like, just by practice, right?
Sure.
It's not entirely intuitive. It's something that actually is learned, and that's something that I don't think I actually realized until much later, because I had grown up on comics at such a young age that it just was second nature to me. And like, when people are, these adults are like, wait, do I look at the words first or the pictures first? Like, why are you even thinking about, like, why is this such a huge issue, right? Mm-hmm. But then you would hear other people talk about it. You'd even talk to some comic people who maybe weren't big comic readers, who wanted to get into the craft of writing comics, and then to me, it just felt like they were overthinking this whole thing, and I just found that fascinating. So when it came to sequential storytelling, I took it like a fish to water, right? Now, with that said, if there are people who are having a hard time maybe reading segments of my story, I don't fault them for their inability to communicate or to comprehend what I've done. I put that on me. I realized, I didn't do my job designing the page well enough for it to just be natural to you to make a natural flow of the story. So, always learning, and I'm always looking at people's reactions to certain parts. And if someone gets lost, then I just consider it, that's my bad.
Yeah. By and large, I think comics are a process of reduction, right? That you're looking to find the best image that can communicate a thought, and then the next best image that connects the two of them together.
Right.
And that's, as you say, that's very much just muscles to where you develop that skill over time.
Yeah. And, talking with people, I remember there was it Cloonan who did A Wrinkle in Time?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So, I remember there was a big conversation on whether or not reading the book compared to the graphic novel was the same experience. And I think what we all reduced was, overall, like, if you paint with a very large brush, like, yes, you get the story, but reading the book and then reading the graphic novel, actually two completely different experiences, like, sure. Someone's really dictating what you're supposed to see in your head. Whereas, you read the book and it's like you paint your own idea of what it is. So, sure. I can't say one is better than the other, but they are definitely, two bigger experiences. I don't see it any different than, honestly, I don't see any different than like reading a book or listening to an audiobook. Quite frankly, I don't know. I think you're really getting the story and then making your own conclusions, and you're having your own feelings about the content. Like, that's how I see it.
Sure, but what the illustrator chooses to show or not to show has an impact upon. Here's an example that I'll give. There's been a lot of movement in the book world to try and put out more young adult graphic novels as opposed to middle grade, right?
Sure.
And what I find when I look at a lot of young adult graphic novels is that they become adult graphic novels. Because as soon as you show something, it makes it real in a way that describing it isn't, right? You
Right.
can say, oh, the person took a baseball bat and hit them, but that's very different than drawing a picture of someone getting hit in the face with a baseball bat.
Exactly.
They're
Yeah.
two completely different things, and the way you process it as an experience as a reader is very, very, very different.
Right. You're right, because like for me, when I read YA graphic novels, for some reason it reads older than in a book, and I think in the right hands, it just makes it I mean, me personally, it just feels like a more like that whole blurred line between what you can constitute as adult or YA just completely dissolves. Right. So there's something really great about that. I mean, I remember reading Mariko Tamaki's, This One Summer. And, you give Jillian Tamaki an opportunity to do a graphic novel, she'll clobber it out of the park. Right.
Yep.
And I remember just reading that book and I was thinking to myself, like, wait, we're calling this a children's book? I mean, the kids are main characters, but, like this just ability to navigate this feeling of when you were a kid around teenagers and just that almost that little slight feeling of danger, just being around them, like, oh, they're talking about grown-up things, like just completely encapsulated that, like that feeling for every page. I thought it was just masterful work.
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
Do you, just because you've come from where you started doing picture books and now you're doing comics, do you think that within the book industry that there's a clear understanding at sort of the editorial level of the difference between the two forms? That's a leading question, I know.
No. It's a fascinating question because I remember I was on a panel with Jeff Smith about this, and we were talking about how, I mean, for years, I think we were all trying to defend the whole idea that graphic novels is real reading, And one of the things that just started popping up, maybe it was the last 5 years, was an example that I said was, if you look at picture books now, they're starting to incorporate paneling. They're starting to incorporate, word balloons. That was something that you never would have seen 10 years ago, right? And that's just the forced influence that you would see over time, right? Like it's just working its way in, and now everyone regards it as a legitimate form of communication, and it wasn't something that had to be preached. Like, no, comics are reading. It just turned into the influence of picture book makers incorporating elements of graphic novel storytelling, and now it just assimilated into the beast, And so that just comes with time, and that's, I guess, in a weird way, if you want to talk about like normalizing graphic novels as normal content, like it just happens over time, and that's, I don't know if you want to call that the entropy of the world, but like it's always in flux, it's always changing. Back in, I remember reading like Jumanji to my son, right? And that Jumanji was way back, like 87, 88. And you're reading Jumanji to your kid and you're like, oh my gosh, the story's like 20,000 words, it's taking me like 20 minutes to read this book.
Yeah.
Something like that, like you wouldn't even see it today, like it's getting simplified. And like that's the whole thing about the evolution of the medium of storytelling is, I remember speaking with J. Otto Siebold about this, and Siebold, in a very cynical way, he was just saying, like, listen, parents don't want to read to their kids, like they want to just, here's your story, 5 minutes later, nighty night, I'm gonna go watch whatever. And I don't want to say that that's the truth, but there is something to be said about just me noticing shorter picture books and things like that, or graphic novels that are engaging enough for kids that they will take it upon themselves to figure out, even if they can't read a certain word, the pictures carry it part way.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your origin story, I mean, you were talking about how you were a reluctant reader.
Yeah.
And yet you read comics.
Right.
You weren't, I'm imagining at least, you weren't a reluctant reader when it came to comics.
Yeah, and so, I don't know if other people were. were drawn to comics for the same reasons that I was. For me, originally, I remember looking at Peanuts. I remember looking at Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield and saying, I want to draw that. I want to draw just like that, right? And so, as someone who grew up not being allowed to take art classes, comics were basically my art education, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I love Garfield for years and years and years. You start drawing like Garfield characters and everybody has these big bubbly eyes for a number of years because you're going through your Garfield phase, but also there's a point where you just kind of realize like, oh, I get it. He hates Mondays, right? And so you start moving around to other things. And so, while you're improving your art, your art style, then you move on to other things. Then you're drawing Marvel comics and then you're like drawing like the Hulk's knee, like peeking through a torn pair of pants. And you're like, why am I drawing these lines? It gets to a point where you're drawing these lines. You don't even understand why you're drawing them, right? And then that moves on to you like studying anatomy just to understand what's going on underneath the skin and muscle and everything like that. And so for me, like the big challenges the big influence I had with comics was, I think we were talking about this earlier before the podcast started, but you have your monthlies and you're thinking to yourself like, oh my gosh, Batman's strapped with, sticks of dynamite and Joker's like, hope I never see you again. And you immediately realize like, well, the comic's called Batman. He's not going anywhere. Right. And so you kind of grow weary of reading the monthlies. Right. And then you're going around somewhere. And I remember very distinctly, in the 80s, like, you go to Walden Books and then you see the spindle of monthly comics, but then you look over to your right and then there's like the grown-up stuff. It's like Judge Dredd and Elektra. And I remember seeing like all these Akira comics, and I remember, I forgot what I want to say, it was like issue 8 where it's like, Kaneda holding, Yamagata's body and like Yamagata's head's gone, right? And it's like just blood all over the cover. And I'm looking at it and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, like you're reading the comic, you're like, oh, one of the main character dies. Like this is going to create ripples in the rest of the comic. I need to know more because like there are consequences for these actions. So I remember just buying up all these Akira comics and going up to the front desk. And of course, like the Walden Books, like cashiers just like, there, have a nice day. And I'm walking out like feeling like I just robbed a bank. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got away with it. Right. And so that was the beauty of comics. It's that back in the day, like, I don't think they were thinking about selling to minors. Like it was just like, hey, you know what? This is the punk world right now. Like if you just stumble upon it, then rock and roll, right? Now you're kind of coming to a point where people are like, well, these comics are for kids, these comics are for adults. But backstage, there's a lot of crossover. There's all these things that you're not aware of, or you talk about book censorship and you shouldn't read this, and it's like, listen. When I was 8 years old, my whole classroom was reading Flowers in the Attic and Stephen King. You're telling us like, we shouldn't be sharing certain stories to certain kids. And it's like, okay, exercise discretion, but it's going to get in the hands of kids at some point. Right. And so for me, when I'm writing, like, I never try to find an age group that I'm writing to. I just say, this is what I'm writing. I'll let the publisher, put the little, for ages 10 to 14 or whatever, but I know it's going to have a broad circulation. And you're kind of going back to the old syndicated comics where, like, look, I might like Garfield, I might like Calvin and Hobbes, but somewhere you're going to find Apartment 3G and you're just like, I have absolutely no idea what this is, So that's kind of the beauty of comics, is that there's still a little bit of punk to it, where it's just like, it's going to go out there, and if you find it, then fantastic.
Yeah, it's funny too, because when you talk about back in the day, especially in the 80s, there was a real movement to say that comics were not for children, like really explicitly, like comics are for adults now, right? Because we have this history in America where Congress, was about to pass a bunch of laws making it so that you couldn't have adult content in comics. And that's where the Comics Code came from. Ultimately, was the publishers self-censoring. And so you had 20 years probably where the publishers were self-censoring the work to not have anything even slightly objectionable into it. And then the underground movement happened, and the pendulum swung way back the other direction.
Right.
You know, yeah. and it really took Scholastic and Jeff Smith coming along, you know, and doing Bone, and then going, oh wait, this can be a success. Maybe comics are for kids, you know. Yeah. Even though when you look at sort of the next thing after Bone would be Raina, probably that was a big success, and I legitimately think that when you look at Raina Telgemeier's comics, those are adult comics. I mean, they're drawn in a kid-friendly way. They don't have bad words, but it's memoir, and it's typically something that kids aren't interested in. If you were to ask them, like, do you want to read about like how this person had to get braces? No, they're not going to want to read that, you know. Right. And yet they will if you do it in the right way, which I think brings us very nicely to this, because this is a memoir. Yeah. So what was your? You said that you're not necessarily designing it for a specific audience, but when you pitched this book, what did you have in mind? Does that make sense as a question?
No, I do. So, you know, and this was an issue that I had with my editor, because we were talking about it, you know, like we were talking about being a teenager in the 1980s is much different than being a teenager now. And one of the biggest things is, you know, this whole Gen X latchkey culture of just pushing a kid out the door and saying, I don't want to see you till the sun comes down. Just go out, just stay out of my face, right? Yep. And much different than today. But the thing that I really wasn't tuned to were all the struggles that kids have as teenagers, right? Because, you know, you're watching your own kids grow up and you realize that the whole idea of just trying to survive through middle school and high school is a very cyclical process. Like, you see the things happen over and over again, you know, popular kids, cliques, and, you know, like feeling awkward around people and not, you know, putting your foot in your mouth and just kind of overcoming that awkwardness. And so, for me, you know, just kind of out of curiosity, asking other people, you know, if you could live your childhood again, would you? Like, the majority of people that I know would say no, you know, and they'd say, well, why? And the majority of people that I would talk to would say, junior high absolutely was the worst time of my life. Sure. And if it wasn't for my son, who saw in the background, when he was 13, just out of the blue, he just asked me, Dad, when was the first time you fell in love? And this was only because, like, he was at an age where girls were starting to, you know, take a liking to him, but, you know, he wasn't quite really aware of anything at the time, right?
Sure.
And so, you know, he was actually, you know, relying to me for some kind of advice or something. And now the relationship that I had with my father, and I don't know if it's a cultural thing or if it's a generational thing, but my father never told me anything about him. So there was a part of him that was just kind of an enigma, because I don't know if he just didn't want to talk about it or whatever. But once I got to know him, because I did end up interviewing him for like another memoir that I'm working on, and he, for some reason, because he saw it as like information that I needed for an assignment, suddenly he just told me everything about him. And when he did, it really humanized my father to realize, I now understand why you are as a person. And as a result, like, I actually understand myself better as a person, because I know why our relationship was the way it was. And so when I talk to my kids, for me, the most important thing was, I just want them to know why I am the way I am. And then they can easily relate to me as a person. And as a result, it's been amazing, because, you know, now they're in high school and you're talking to other parents and they're just saying, like, you know, like, my kid just hides up in his room, just talks to his friends, on his phone, never says a word to us. I have a very open, honest relationship with my kids now, because they just see me as, you know, infallible. I'm making the same mistakes that they did. And that's the thing about the cyclical nature of growing up, is that you will be at a school, or you will see your kids, or you will see other kids, and you will see them make mistakes, and you'll say, I remember going through that. And here we are 35 years later since I was 13, and it just seems to be hitting the same things, the same beats, you know? And that's really the nature of what this story is about. So, you know, the other part about it is that this story takes place on a European trip, but I don't overemphasize the idea that we get to run free all through Paris and all through Switzerland and London. The idea almost kind of feels like, hey, you got dropped off at the mall, you're going to come back here at 5, right? But what happens in between is among teenagers, and it's a very teenage experience. So I think you have to sit back and you have to think about what it is that you want to communicate to the audience that you're writing to, and then be in tune with that, you know? So the other part is, you know, there was a part where, you know, my editor was just like, well, why don't you talk about your Asian experience of growing up in, you know, a white rural Christian community? And I said, I think there's a way to tell stories about being Asian without it being like, hey, look at me, I'm Asian. Here's a story about me being Asian. It just, instead, it's a life story that is universally told to anybody that can relate to it. I just happen to be Asian, right? Yeah. You have to really think about, like, well, how can I present this to maximize your broad appeal? Not to say that I'm like going, like thinking, you know, like how can I get as many people to buy this book? But the idea is how, like, what is in its core is the thing that people will relate to. You know, that's the most important part to me.
Yeah, and I think that those kind of universal feelings are almost more important to get people to understand what your experience was, rather than, oh, here's my silo of this is unique to me. You know?
Right. You know, because I do think for me, I think, you know, the being able to relate to people, you know, like so if you're having a conversation with somebody, for example, you know, maybe you don't have a whole lot of things in common, right? But if you're willing to meet part way, or maybe if you know fragments of something that they may relate to, then you start having a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I emphasize in this story is, you know, having a bias. You know, sometimes you look at someone, like the media very much trounce up, you know, like, oh my gosh, it's awful in Florida. Oh gosh, it's awful in Texas. But you actually fly to those places and you interact with the kids, and those kids really are no different than kids in Seattle or New York or Chicago. They're just going through kid things, right? And so for me, you know, the importance of actually interacting and engaging, and then being able to have something to communicate that you find yourself on equal ground with, that you can both kind of relate to. Like, yeah, junior high sucks, right? Like everybody can relate to that, and that's where the conversation starts, right? And there's no left-leaning bias or right-leaning bias. It's just like, hey, we all agree that being in junior high was awful. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that was really ultimately the whole lesson that I learned from the trip was, you know, you grow up in a small town, and because you don't have any life experiences, if everyone calls you a loser, you're thinking, well, if this whole town thinks I'm a loser, then I must be a loser, because how can all these people be wrong, right? But it isn't until you get out of that town and you interact with people outside of the town and you realize that actually the world is a lot kinder than you realize. That's when you realize, oh, I'm not a loser. It just happens to be that I was stuck in a niche that was beyond my control, and I just had to adapt to it. But it was from that realization that I said, I need to get out of this town.
Yeah. I think we had it relatively easier being children in the 80s, because so the reason I think so is because culture was still monoculture then, right? Like there were 5 television networks, and that was it.
Sure.
And because there were only 5 and they were competing very tightly with one another, they kept to sort of the same narrative, if you see what I mean. Whereas today, you know, someone can be in,
okay, I see what you're saying.
As you noted, the right-wing point of view versus the left-wing point of view, and they're no longer speaking the same language anymore.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying.
There's no commonality between those things, and I think that's hard sometimes.
Absolutely.
Growing up today, you know.
Yeah. I mean, from my experience, it was, you know, a slight skew on you know, that monotone you know, messaging from the 5 networks, or what you say. But you know, in the cultural zeitgeist of it all, you know, me as an Asian American, you know, like coming to America, like my parents they just kind of tried to fit in as best as possible.
Sure.
But, you know, there were awkward moments that I had growing up where I was like, I went into kindergarten, I'm like, who's Santa Claus? And all the kids were like, you moron, you know, like, of course, like every December, there's a fat guy that comes down the chimney and gives presents to all the good kids, right? And I always just constantly felt like I was just one step behind everybody else, just trying to figure out like what is life in America supposed to be like. And so I relied a lot on pop culture and like movies and TV. And so from my personal experience, you're watching that messaging coming off from that. And you know, from my growing up, it was like you had your Long Duck Dongs, you had, you know, Gung Ho and movies like that. And you're looking at it and you're realizing, oh, are we supposed to be the funny guys? Are we the clowns? Like we're the ones that talk funny. And so for me, it was like there was a branding of a certain thing, but then also, you know, kind of thinking, you know, in terms of your self-image, like, is that how the rest of us sees it? You know, because everybody's branded you that way. And so it took a long time for me to kind of come to the realization that, you know, oh, it wasn't. Because when you're young and impressionable, you're thinking, oh, that's my role. And I think that's where I ended up having a sense of humor, because I thought, I guess I have to be funny, right? So that's my personal experience growing up.
I love how they both can be true.
Right. Absolutely.
So to go back to the question where I started that with, when you were pitching this book, did you have a middle reader in mind, or were you thinking, I'm just talking to my peers, if you see what I mean?
No, I hear what you're saying. So this actually wasn't the original memoir that I was sought out to do. I was going to do a story about, you know, the relationship, the cultural differences that I had between me and my parents, you know, me growing up, you know, from a Western philosophy, my parents growing up from Thailand, and how there was just this clash between us and me wanting to be an artist. Right. And that, you know, so that actually brewed up because I was speaking with Gene Yang at the Miami Book Festival. And then we were, you know, waiting for our flights, and we were just sharing stories about, you know, growing up Asian kids in America. Very similar stories. And it was Gene that actually told me, you know, he said, you should write a book about that. And so as years went on, I finally got around to doing this story. But what I didn't expect was there was going to be a lot of emotional heavy lifting involved with trying to, you know, kind of communicate those painful moments. Right. And so it wasn't until my son, you know, asking me about the first time I fell in love, and I thought about it, and I said, oh, it was this trip to Europe that I took. And I'm telling my kids about all these things that we did. And I have two sons, and their minds were both blown. Like, you did what? You snuck into Wimbledon? Like, you watched John McEnroe play? Like, this is crazy, right? And then I'm telling my editor this, and she stops me. She's like, wait, whoa. Like, why did you never tell me this story? And I said, oh, because we're doing this other story about my parents and me and my mom's breast cancer. And she says, no, you have a whole story here, and it's about you kind of finding your self-confidence, you know, in the world. Like, this is amazing. Like, stop this story and do this story, because you're clearly passionate about it. And it's an amazing story, because like it also was true, you know. And then that was where you have to like reach out to all the people that were on the trip and say, hey, remember that trip we took out in 1989? Like, I'm writing a book about it, right? And of course, you know, one of the characters in the book is a girl that was your first kiss, and you know, like you haven't really. I mean, you found each other on Facebook, but like, you know, you're just kind of hovering in the same circles, and then you kind of have to bring up the whole thing to her and say, hey, yes, obviously you're going to be a very big part of this story. I hope that doesn't weird you out. Like, I'm not having some weird midlife crisis kind of thing, right? Yeah. And she was amazing. She was just like, listen, my kids know your books. They know your cartoon show. Like, I'm actually, honestly, kind of flattered by all this, right? And, you know, she gave me her journal, and it was amazing because it had, like, name of hotels, what the weather was like, what we ate. And she was an amazing part of this whole process in terms of research, sending me photos that I hadn't seen before. And as it went on, you know, it almost turned into like a family reunion. Like, everybody, bringing stuff from the table, like, oh, I have these photos. Like, in fact, there's one scene in the book where, this girl, Joy, she buys a drawing from me for $20. Well, it wasn't until I told her that I was making this book that she messaged me. She says, I still have that dragon you drew me, like, back in 8th grade. I still have it, like, hanging on the wall. And I remember thinking, I was like, what are you talking about? What drawing? She takes a photo. She's like, here, this dragon drawing. And then suddenly, like, it was as if my memories were just sitting in the back of my brain. They just came to the front, like, oh, now I remember, like, I can't believe, like, my mind blocked this out after all these years, but I remember this drawing. And you realize, oh boy, that'd be a great way to build, character development and story. And it was what initially started as something that my son, brought to my mind, and then telling my editor that it would be a story that would be great to share with people. Then it turned into like a whole reunion, and you kind of want to tell this story to the best to the best you can, to honor everybody that was on the trip, especially the first girl you kissed. You don't want to sullen those memories, right? Like, you don't want to make something that she doesn't like, and suddenly she's like, oh my gosh, well, I had these fond memories of the trip, but then he wrote a book I didn't like, so now I don't know how to feel, So you're navigating many different things, but once the product's done and it's out there in the world being shared with everybody, it becomes all those things, right? So while it started as a kid's book, it's become so much more. Like, I've been getting so many like emails and direct messages from people that had similar experiences, or like their kids who are really quiet and reluctant, like when I was, I got this great email from this kid named George, who was out in Chicago, and he's like, I saw your panel, like, I've been having a hard time in school, like, this really brought a smile to my face. Like, it means so much more to me to hear that than even from somebody who just said, like, they simply enjoyed the book. Like, it's one of these cases where it's like, I feel like I'm actually making a difference.
Yeah. It's interesting too that you didn't. It sounds like you never formally pitched this book. You just kind of fell backwards.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. It did, and I'm glad it did, because it was the book. This pandemic. This book took me 4 years. This thing got me through the pandemic.
Right.
You look at the news, you're like, well, this is a dumpster fire. Well, I'm going to draw, me in Paris, like, it was just it. There's the great thing about this is that, while I'm making this book, I realized that the 13-year-old me is still healthy and alive inside of me. And like, these old feelings that you have, they're still there. And I remember feeling weirded out by it, like, like, why am I having these feelings? I remember reaching out to Raina, and I remember reaching out to Shannon Hale saying, is this a weird thing? Like, I'm having these feelings of like when I was 13. And I remember Raina was just like, no, those are completely normal. You're not crazy, but it's like the kid in you is still very healthy inside. And you're just dissecting every moment of a moment that like happened 35 years ago. And it's just kind of amazing that you can just kind of bring those feelings back to life. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. I am curious, what was your kids' reaction to the final book?
I think they heard me talk about it so much, and they saw me work on it for so long that they're just kind of like, there's that book. But there was a moment where they were asking me about Amy, the girl in the book, and they're like, oh, do you still talk to her? And I'm like, yeah, I'm chatting with her right now on Facebook. And they're like, can we see what she looks like? And then I think that was the moment where they're like, oh my gosh, this is a real person. She has a husband and 2 kids. And then they were like, she kind of looks like mom, and you're like, go, just go. But yeah, I think the part that really opens their eyes, it's just, you have these photos, you're still talking to these people, and in respect to the adventures that I had, it's more like, oh my gosh, you were a kid, like you were a kid. And you're still interacting with these people that you only knew for 3 weeks, but it's been 35 years. Like, that's a little mind blowing to them, because they've had moments where they've gone to like summer camp or something, and it's like then the thought to them is just like, wait a sec, what if I ran into that person 35 years later? Like, that would be weird. Yeah.
Sure. Well, particularly because, I mean, it sounds to me like you wouldn't have been in contact with these people had it not been needing to for the book, right?
So, you know, because
were you in contact with Eve before that?
Yeah. So, okay. So with Amy, like after the trip ended, we wrote to each other for 6 years, you know, and then it wasn't, but like somewhere in my sophomore year of college, we kind of lost touch because of, you know, just moving around constantly. Right. But then Facebook comes out and I got this message from her, you know, like in 2009. And it was like, can't tell by your profile picture, but are you the Dan SENTAT that I went to Europe with in 1989, 90? And I was just like, whoa, is this the first girl I ever kissed? Like, this is amazing, right? And so I think that was just a curious nature of people when social media first came out, like with Facebook, like, oh, I wonder what happened to so-and-so. I wonder what happened to so-and-so. And so, I mean, that trip clearly had an impact on a lot of people. So, you know, remembered my name, looked me up, and then, you know, we reconnected in 2009. And then you would just look at photos, but yeah, like when it was time to really talk about the actual events and the story, then it just shifted gears, took it to a whole other level.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I think that's great. I mean, I'm not in contact with anybody from those ages at this point, you know.
Oh, sure, right.
You know, I mean, yeah, you're right. I know some of them on Facebook, but it's such a like, oh, look at what they're doing over there, but it doesn't connect to me today.
So it's interesting because you would talk, like I remember I would talk to Amy about a particular moment, and I think you get a little self-conscious because you're thinking, was I the only one that remembered every little detail of that moment? And like, there were certain moments where she would say, oh, no, like, I remember that. And this is what I was thinking. And you're like, oh my God, you were thinking about that like intensely too. Like, that's okay. I'm not like, you know, crazy, you know? But the other part that I remember while doing this research is out of everybody in the group, for some reason, I clearly had the best memory out of everything, you know, like, you know, going to Wimbledon, for instance, you know, it's like, there were so many little details that, you know, the person I was with forgot about, like, oh, didn't even remember getting lost in a train yard, you know, I remember there was another part where I was specifically saying, like, you guys, do you remember there, you know, when we were in Paris, the hotel across from our hotel was called Hotel Satan. And everyone's just like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I'm not dreaming this. Like, I know that Hotel Satan is a real place, you know? You know, it's like written in like really poor, like Helvetica. You would think a place called Hotel Satan would have like this really amazing font, but no, they chose Helvetica, right? You know? So even like back then I had this graphic design sensibility, like I would choose a different font for that hotel.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. Now that you've been working in memoir, does it increase your desire to keep doing more memoir, or are you eager to do more fiction, or are you trying to find a balance?
So I for my personal life, I think there's one more memoir in me, and that's the one about, you know, the story of my parents. Again, like there's a lot of emotional heavy lifting that's involved in the project. And then also, you know, with that goes research, you know, getting the facts right. If anything from this, I've been inspired by the lives of my other friends. So, you know, I had a friend that he grew up as a punk rocker in Palm Springs, like in the 1970s, right? And you know, there was this one crazy summer. He tells me about how Iggy Pop checks into the Betty Ford clinic for substance abuse, like he's just trying to recover from substance abuse, and he sees these 4 punk rockers, like mohawks and leather jackets, in Palm Springs, you know, back in that Bob Hope golfing era, right? And like he tells me there's amazing stories of hanging out with Iggy Pop, you know, in Palm Springs for a summer. And I'm thinking, that's an amazing story. It's not my memoir, but that's an amazing story that I would love to tell someday, you know, like you get inspired by other people's stories. If anything, for me, I do feel like after doing this memoir, I'm more comfortable doing older content, longer format. So right now, what I've got on my plate is actually a middle grade novel that is about urban legends in Los Angeles and things like that. So it's definitely whetted my appetite for older material. And so I think you're going to see me kind of navigating in this older market for a bit.
Yeah. No, that's great. Let me ask a craft question or two, just because I am curious. One of the things that strikes me as a feature of your style is the coloration on the noses and the cheeks.
Yeah.
But you said that you've got a colorist. How I can't quite square that circle.
So the colorist really is more like a flatter.
Okay.
And like, so I would just have the artists, they lived out in Italy, and I would just give them color keys, and I just asked them to leave everything in layers. Fantastic colors, Abe Erskine. And I said, try to maintain a certain palette for a country. Like, I guess the best way I can equate it to is like if you play Grand Theft Auto, like if you're driving in LA, the palette does a lot of the heavy lifting of where you are in a neighborhood. And I just think that's fantastic. So I said, if you're going to address a certain country, just keep a certain palette in mind. Right. And then they flatted the whole thing, which saved me weeks, months of work, because the flatting's the hardest part, but then I would go in and I would do the highlights and shadows and, the tinting of the cheeks and everything like that.
Okay.
The lighting effects. And that for me would take me about a half hour per page. So, so I could knock out, like, once it was time to do the final touches, I could do about 5 or 6 pages a day. Like, if like the flatting part was a big, part of just getting all that heavy lifting out of the way. So I'm very thankful for the colors to do that job.
Yeah. And what about the actual sort of final drawings? I suppose. What's your production rate at? Are you doing a page a day? More?
Trying to. I remember I would tell myself 2 pages a day, or a spread a day, like if that's how you want to put it. And so, some pages took longer than others, and you'd drop your kids off at school, you'd sit at the desk at like 9, and then you'd be inking till 1. And so I had other projects on my lap, and like those were kind of falling a little behind, because I definitely adhered to that schedule of saying I need to ink 2 pages a day. Thankfully, or maybe I don't know how you want to say it, but we were in a pandemic. So I wasn't going anywhere anyway. Right. So it's like, I ink those 2 pages. I can still do the picture book stuff afterwards. Don't know if I would have been able to handle it with that same amount of efficiency today.
Yeah.
But,
how much did you need to go and sort of do research on what cars looked like then, what clothes looked like then?
Right. So thankfully I had a lot of friends. I had a photo album full of just bad blurry photos, but relied on friends to share photos and just upload it into a Dropbox folder so I could see, and I could get a pretty good sense. I did go out on a trip to London in 2019 because I wanted to remember what it was like to get to Wimbledon off the Wimbledon stop. Because I remember going to Wimbledon and getting off, and for some reason I immediately thought, like, the doors to the Wimbledon tennis tournament would just be right there. And I remember coming out into this adorable little town just saying, like, wait, where's the tennis? And so I decided to turn off my phone and just wander around and just try to find Wimbledon just with my own instincts, right? And, there were certain buildings that would jog your memory. You take a picture of that. You remember there was a park somewhere, and then, okay, so, you're wandering around till you find the park, and then the park kind of jogs a memory. Now it's funny because you go there and there's all these signs like Wimbledon, like the tennis club is this way, and it's like, oh, that would have been handy 35 years ago, But like, but like I would look at the photos, I would rely on Amy's journal and the name of the hotels and things like that and what street it was on. And I would go back. It was because I didn't even realize this, but like the Airbnb that we stayed at was on Earl's Court. And I was just like, wait a sec, Earl's Court was the actual stop I stayed in, you know, back in 1989. Like, what are the odds that we booked, you know, an Airbnb in that same neighborhood?
Right.
And so I'm walking around and I'm looking at the old photos of Earl's Court, and it changed so much. Like, it changed tremendously to the point where I was trying to find the hotel that we stayed at in 1989. The whole block was demolished. They tore down the whole block. It was just empty. And I said, oh, I wouldn't be able to like check it out even if I wanted to, because the whole block is gone, right? But then you go back to Wimbledon, and here was one thing that I remember having a moment about, because when we sat and we watched the men's semifinal match between McEnroe and Edberg, you know, everyone after the match got up and they were taking pictures of this woman with, you know, short blonde hair, and like, frantically, just a frantic pace, people taking pictures. And I remember, you know, me and my friend thinking, is that Princess Diana? Is Princess Diana here? Right. Mm. And so I went back to Wimbledon. I met with a historian, and I asked him, I was just like, listen, so I snuck into the semifinal match of 1989, wondering if Princess Diana was at that match. And he asks me, he says, well, where were you sitting exactly? And I said, oh, sitting here at section 211, you know? And he looks at it and he's just like, wait a sec, like what, how did you even get into that section? And I said, you know what? I think it was the 1980s, you know, and security was not top notch back then, right? So, you know, he looks at it and he says, if you sat here, that meant that you sat right behind, you know, where the family of the players were, which meant that you probably sat behind John McEnroe's wife, Tatum O'Neal, you know, and that just kind of filled in the blanks. So it was in that respect where, you know, the research came in handy, because maybe just out of your own general curiosity, you know, you answered some of those mysterious questions. But, you know, a lot of it, you just kind of, if you Google, like, you know, London 1980s, you're going to get a pretty good idea of what you want. But then also, I remember there was this one park in Vienna, and all I had was a picture of like this mansion that was like in this park in Vienna. And I just did the thing where I just Googled every park in Vienna on Google Maps. And then I just did the street view. I said, is the mansion in this park? No. Okay. Is the mansion in this park? And I remember like 2 weeks of like searching, I finally found the park. I remember just getting so excited, like, oh my God, this is the park that we were at. And then you just start using the Google Maps, and you're just walking around the neighborhood, just trying to get the feel. Like, Google Maps was very handy for me in terms of jogging my memory. Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
You know, back in the day, it used to be that artists would have to have, you know, giant folders full of photographs and reference, right, and, you know, a whole file cabinet. I mean, I know artists from that time who had, like, you know, a drawer, literally a drawer full of cars, right, so that they can reference cars. But now you just Google it and it just all pops up.
Right. Pretty much.
That's kind of funny. Yeah. The font that's being used, is that a font that's based on your handwriting? Or
yeah. So, I mean, it started off, I had hand lettered like one of my first picture books, The Adventures of Beagle. And then they really, like the publisher at the time, they really liked it. So they took my handwriting, turned it into a font, which I have now named Dan Bedeca. So I'm Dan Bedeca. Yeah.
I love that. That's great, man. Did you just from the technical point of view, are you laying out your own balloons, or is the art director doing that?
I am, you know, like, oh God, because I can be pretty sloppy when it comes to being a craftsman. So, like, you know, I see all these other people just doing all these beautiful, elegant word balloons and giving enough space for the type. Whereas, like, I will draw a panel, I'll say, I'm going to try to shove this text into this spread, like, as an afterthought. Like, it was just really bad. But yeah, like, I'm that my word balloons and things like that, that's still a work in progress. Like, I know that's something I can improve on. So I need to find a system that's a little bit more efficient in that. So, you know.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, we have been talking for quite a while. I can't believe we've been over an hour already. Because this is a great conversation. But let's start wrapping it up. As I start with the same first question, I have two final questions, which are the same in every interview. The first one's really easy. Is there anything you would like to plug that you might have coming up?
Yeah,
keep an eye out.
I mean, just the first time for everything. That's, I'd love
Which is
for
what we're
everybody
talking about now.
yeah. So it's that, and then so a lot of people are familiar with my first graphic novel, Sidekicks, which came out in 2010. I actually just signed on to do 3 more, and so they're doing a re-release of Sidekicks in the fall with 16 new pages, and then we're going to be followed by books 2, 3, and 4. And it's going to have an overall story arc about all the characters and their origins. I also have.
How far into those the later volumes are you?
So far I've outlined them, and then my editor went on maternity leave, so we're gonna be really revving it up in the next few weeks, just moving up to speed. My idea is that I'm actually going to write all 3, and then I can just spend the rest of the time drawing them, because I think if I have it in my plate and I know what I have to do, then I think I'd be more successful at hitting my deadlines. So I have that. I have a picture book coming out with Jake Gyllenhaal in October called The Secret Society of Aunts and Uncles. And then in November, I have a book series coming out with Henry Winkler and Lynn Oliver called Detective Duck.
Wow.
Yeah. So my hands are full. And then right now, working on 3 new Sidekicks books, and what appears to be my first attempt at a middle grade novel that my editor really liked, because she read the outline just a couple days ago.
Wow. Sounds like you got a busy lineup of stuff coming.
Oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm working on with folks like Mo Willems and things like that. But that's just I'd be talking your ear off.
Yeah, that's great that you're staying so busy and
if I was alone with my thoughts, I'd go crazy.
Yeah. Dig it. How has the post-pandemic changed your work? Are you still finding that time to focus as intently as you were able to, or is it harder now?
It's less about the pandemic. It's less about the after effects of the pandemic, but it's more about my kids are my oldest son is going to be applying to college next year. And, both of my kids are in high school, and my youngest son always going out as a social butterfly. Oh, hey dad, can you drive us to the mall? Hey dad, can you drive us to the movies? So you're just I need to get this work done, and you need me to, drive you out 20 minutes because LA, all your friends live 20 minutes away, Right. So the thing that really pulls me out of the studio is, having to be a parent, right?
Yeah.
And then having 3 dogs and 2 cats and a bird, and navigating all that. Also because book tours, I just got back from book tour. That's 10 days of not sitting in the studio and working. So,
sure.
Things just get more complicated. But in terms of the effects post-pandemic, I miss people, So when it's an opportunity to go speak in Texas, in Chicago, in Boston, I'm on a plane because I didn't realize that how much I missed, speaking with kids. Yeah. There was a year and a half where you're interacting with kids on Zoom. It was the absolute worst. Yeah. Because there were even ones where they, to protect the kids' privacy, we've turned off the monitor, we've turned off the camera. So you'd be speaking to a black screen,
right.
with the mute on, and you're just cracking jokes thinking I hope you're laughing on the other end, right?
Yeah.
It's just a haunting thing. So yeah, missing the interactions with kids and having them, give you feedback on how you're doing. It's just, so I miss people even more. Now I'm more eager to go out. I feel like I'm making up for lost time.
I dig that, man. I dig that. Cool. All right. Well, and then the last question is, as I said, this is a long series of creator interviews that we do. And one of the things I hear a lot from our viewers are people who want to make comics themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know how to start. They're unsure of their own ability. They don't think they're good enough. And so I always like asking creators, if you were to give a piece of advice to someone who wants to create but is unsure about the right way to go about it, what would that piece of advice be? And it could be something physical. It could be something practical. It could be something emotional or spiritual.
Sure. So gosh, I have quite a bit. So, you know, I think most importantly for me, like, I think the thing that really got me into comics was just having the courage to make your first one. And that could be, you know, that could be a little 3-panel, you know, Garfield joke. That could be you doing fan comics of something like well, one of my first comics was, you know, Spider-Man comic where it was just him fighting. It was a terrible comic, but like you're having fun making action scenes. And then once you get comfortable, you know, doing those things, then you start making your own storylines, your own narratives. And, you know, it's probably something that you keep to yourself. Like, you know, you just kind of look at it and you're looking at your work, which brings me to the other part is that, you know, there was a period where right after we all graduated from art school, you know, a friend and colleague of mine, Kazu Kibuishi, he had his website, boltcity.com. He had a message board on there. Now, if I were to tell you who was on that message board, it was a time capsule of people who became some of the biggest comic people back then. But if he still had it, I don't remember when he took it down, but it was like people like Raina Telgemeier that were like making posts like, I hope people like to read my comics someday. Like, it was like this amazing little time capsule of, you know, who are your favorite comic people before they became your favorite comic people. Like, if you could just read a thread of their insecurities and like the stuff that they were sharing, like it was just an amazing, you know, gold mine of like historical knowledge. And, you know, it was one of those things where if you have a community of people that are supportive and they're listening and giving like honest feedback, it doesn't have to be a huge group of people. It doesn't have to be a message board. It could just be, you know, something simple as, you know, like one other friend and just sharing your little comics like that. You know, someone to get feedback on, someone that you trust, someone you're not afraid to, you know, open your heart to, right? An audience, even your own mother, you know, something. But, you know, it starts off by you just kind of finding your own footing, seeing if it's something that you even like to do, right? And then finding a community of people that share in that same interest, and then kind of easing into, you know, the comfort of sharing it with people that you don't know. And there was another thing that we used to do. It was the beginning of every month, we would do a day where you'd say, okay, everyone, you know, make a comic on just a single piece of paper. You can put in as many panels as you want. It would be a single page comic or whatever, but like, just, you know, try to tell a story, beginning, middle, and end, just on one page of paper. And that is, you know, just a valuable exercise in terms of, you know, designing a space, you know, pacing a story, using the right number of panels, adding more panels, less panels. But, you know, it's all about putting in the mileage. And I think, you know, again, like the idea of making a graphic novel is a very daunting task in your head. But, you know, if it starts off with 1-page comics, then slowly it turns into 5-page comics, 10-page comics, 20-page comics. And then it just blows up into something else. And, you know, again, like I said, it's that mountain that you climb. You know, it feels daunting at first, but once you get hooked, then, you know, you're looking for the next mountain to climb.
Yeah. I love it. That's a great answer, man. I really want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
It's been I've had a blast. I hope you have too.
Yeah, no, it's outstanding. Yeah, and the next time in the Hate District, I'll stop by the shop. Yeah.
No, well, and you know, let me know ahead of time, and we'll do a whole thing.
Absolutely.
I've got we've got this really cool bathroom where all the artists come in and draw, and so I think you'll really like it too. Hold on a second. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping here, and then we'll wrap this up. Put me on a 1, please, Ben. Hello. So if you're sitting at home and you're looking for a book to read, you really cannot do much better than A First Time for Everything by Dan SENTAT here. It's a really smart book. It's a really touching book. It has a lot of beautiful history, a lot of real emotional stuff. It's one of those things that really makes me glad that this is how I make my living, is selling these things, because I feel really good about this book. So you should absolutely get it. You can get it from us too. There'll be a thing at the bottom of the screen at some point saying our store, but there you are. Next week, we have the Adult Club, and the Adult Club's book is Why Don't You Love Me by Paul Rainey. He's in the UK, so we're doing it on a Sunday morning as well because of the time difference. So look for that next Sunday, same bat time. That's going to be a pretty good conversation, I think. And then next month's Kids Club will be Scurry here by Max Smith. I'm looking forward to this. This is a really nice painted book, super realistic art. I think you guys are going to like it a lot. So that's the next couple of shows coming up. I want to thank my producer, Jordan, for doing a bunch of backstage stuff that nobody sees except for me, but he does it so well that it allows me to do this. I want to thank Ben for running the camera and doing the show and taking care of all the technical stuff. I want to thank my staff. I want to thank Zoe, Kat, and Katie for running the store basically and allowing me the freedom to sit and have conversations with cartoonists about making comics because, otherwise I wouldn't have the time of the day to do it. So, and they're awesome and it makes the store great. And I want to thank all of you who are sitting and watching these things at home and buying great comics because we couldn't do it without you. And then the last thing that I want to, and person and thing I want to thank is I want to thank Dan and all of the cartoonists like him, because without these guys, I would not have a store full of comics that I can sell. So thank you, my friend, for making comics and for making great comics like this one.